To most of Britain, Cliff Richard has always looked like the same man. The boyish smile, the spotless reputation, the Christmas songs that play in every supermarket every December. He is the only artist in UK chart history to land a top 10 single across 6 different decades. A knight of the realm, a man who has sold well over 250 million records. But underneath that polished surface sat a very different existence, one built on private grief, unrelenting scrutiny, and a solitude he rarely let the cameras see. This is the story of the gap between the Cliff Richard the world thought it knew, and the man who was actually living behind the image. He was born Harry Roger Webb on October 14, 1940 in Lucknow, India, where his father worked in catering for the Indian Railways and his mother came from an Anglo-Indian family. The family relocated to England in 1948 as India moved toward independence, arriving with little beyond their belongings and the hope of starting over. It was an ordinary immigrant story at first, a modest home, a new school, an unfamiliar country, and a teenager trying to fit into a culture he barely recognized. But Harry fell for the skiffle craze sweeping Britain in the mid-1950s, and when his father bought him his first guitar, it set in motion a transformation nobody in that household could have predicted. He put together a school vocal group and later performed with the local skiffle outfit before assembling his own band, which would eventually become the Drifters and then, to avoid confusion with the American group of the same name, the Shadows. By 1958, under the stage name Cliff Richard, he had recorded Move It, a track reportedly cut in under an hour that is still credited by many music historians as the moment British rock and roll found its own voice rather than simply imitating American records. Almost overnight, a teenager from a working immigrant family became the country's answer to Elvis Presley, and the trajectory of his life changed permanently before he had even finished growing up. What followed looks, from a distance, like an uninterrupted fairy tale. Cliff Richard and the Shadows dominated the singles charts through the early 1960s with songs like Living Doll and Summer Holiday, and starred together in feature films of the same names that turned into some of the biggest box office draws of their era in Britain. He packed out concert halls, appeared constantly on television, and received sacks of fan mail every week. The full machinery of pop stardom, running at full speed, years before most people his age had settled into a career at all. But that speed came at a cost most fans never saw. While his peers were building families and settling into ordinary adult routines, Cliff was living out of tour buses, studios, and hotel rooms, a schedule that left almost no room for anything resembling a normal private world. He would later describe those years as thrilling but exhausting in a way that never really let up. One album blending into the next, one tour barely finished before the next one began. Then, in 1964, at the height of his fame, he did something almost no pop star of that era did. He became a committed, publicly declared Christian. He began rethinking the lyrics he would sing, turning down certain bookings, and reportedly considered stepping away from music altogether. Industry insiders at the time worried it would end his career. Instead, his sound and image matured rather than collapsed, and he built a different kind of longevity, one rooted in consistency rather than rebellion. But that choice also set him apart from the culture around him. He wasn't part of the party scene that defined so much of the music industry, and that distance, whatever its rewards, was also a kind of isolation. His faith fed directly into a lifelong habit of quiet philanthropy that rarely made headlines the way his chart records did. Cliff has said for years that he donates roughly 10% of his income to charity, with a particular focus on organizations funding medical research, and he has supported causes ranging from Christian missionary work to children's charities across multiple continents. That steady, low-profile generosity became part of the same discipline that shaped his public image, the same instinct to hold things together quietly rather than perform his private convictions for an audience. In 1995, that decades-long body of work, both musical and charitable, was formally recognized when he was knighted, becoming Sir Cliff Richard, one of relatively few pop musicians of his generation to receive the honor. Nowhere has that private cost been more visible than in his relationship status. Cliff Richard is never married and has no children, a fact that has followed him for more than 60 years, in part because of his own 1962 hit Bachelor Boy, a song about staying single that fans kept singing back at him decade after decade as it slowly stopped being a joke and started being a headline. He has always resisted giving one tidy explanation for it. In his memoir and in interviews over the years, he has said plainly that a touring, constantly public career made it extremely difficult to sustain a marriage, and that by the time he might have paused to reconsider, the years had already moved past him. The most publicly dissected relationship of his life was with tennis star Sue Barker, which began in 1982 after Cliff spotted her at a tournament in Brighton and asked her out. What followed was less a storybook romance than a stop-start relationship played out almost entirely in public, with tabloids tracking every reconciliation and every reported split. Barker herself once flew home in tears from a holiday, telling reporters at the time that the pressure of the coverage was becoming too much and that she didn't know if the relationship could continue. It did, on and off, for a few more years. Cliff has said in interviews since that he seriously considered proposing to her, but ultimately felt he did not love her quite enough to commit to spending the rest of his life together. Barker, for her part, pushed back decades later in her own memoir, writing that she has grown tired of the relationship being raised in his interviews and that, in truth, it mattered far less to her at the time than it apparently still does to him. It's a small but telling detail. Two people who lived through the same headline-making romance, carrying two quite different memories of what it actually meant. His bachelor status has also fed decades of public speculation about his sexuality, something Cliff has addressed head-on more than once rather than simply letting it hang in the air. In one Australian television interview, he pushed back on the endless rumors directly, asking why it would even matter if he were gay, and pointing out that he has gay friends and doesn't see why that question should define how people see him. He has also said in other interviews that he never took a vow of celibacy and has simply prioritized his career over marriage. Whatever the private truth, what's clear is that he has spent much of his adult life fielding a question he never fully volunteered to answer. For over 30 years, one relationship anchored his personal life more than any romance ever did: his friendship with Bill Latham, his close friend and former manager, with whom he shared a home for 3 decades, along with Latham's mother and later Cliff's own mother during her illness. It was the kind of steady, decades-long companionship that outlasted every headline romance the tabloids chased, and when Latham died in 2022, those close to Cliff described it as one of the most painful losses of his life. In recent years, his day-to-day companion has been John McEllen, a former missionary who now helps manage Cliff's properties in Barbados and Portugal. Family loss has run alongside the fame for most of his adult life, largely out of public view. His father, who bought him that first guitar and helped set the whole trajectory of his life in motion, died relatively young, before he could watch his son's career fully take off, a loss that pushed a young Cliff into the role of provider for his mother and 3 younger sisters almost overnight, at exactly the moment his own career was starting to demand everything he had. There was no real space, in that period, for him to simply fall apart. The discipline and composure the public came to associate with his image was, in part, forged under that early pressure to keep everything together for the people depending on him. Decades later, he watched his mother's decline from Alzheimer's disease over more than 10 years before her death in 2007. A slow, quiet grief that unfolded largely in private and never made headlines the way his music did. Visit after visit spent with a parent who increasingly no longer recognized him. Then in 2016, his sister Donna died suddenly, arriving just weeks after the darkest professional ordeal of his life had finally come to an end. By his own account, Donna had been one of his closest sources of support throughout that ordeal, which made her death land with particular force at a moment when he might otherwise have expected some relief. That ordeal began in August 2014, when police raided Cliff's Berkshire home as part of an investigation into an allegation of historic sexual abuse, dating back decades. He wasn't even there. He was on holiday in Portugal when a BBC helicopter filmed the raid live, and reporters camped outside his gates, turning a private investigation into a national spectacle before he had been charged with anything at all. He never was. The investigation was dropped in 2016 for lack of evidence, and South Yorkshire Police later paid him £700,000 in a settlement along with a public apology. But the damage from those nearly 2 years was already done. Cliff has said the experience left him feeling, in his own word, contaminated, that he lost weight, struggled to sleep, and at times feared the stress alone might be enough to break his health. In 2018, he won a landmark privacy case against the BBC, with a high court judge ruling that the broadcaster's coverage had been unlawful and, in the judge's words, presented in a somewhat sensationalist way. Cliff was awarded £210,000 in damages plus significant legal costs. It was a legal victory, and by most measures a vindication. But Cliff has said in the years since that a public accusation, once broadcast, never fully disappears, that it remains searchable online indefinitely, long after the truth has been established, while the person who made the original claim stayed anonymous the entire time. Winning the case didn't undo that imbalance, and he has spoken about how the experience changed the way he moves through public life, making him warier of strangers and more protective of his privacy than he had ever been before. Partly because of that chapter, Cliff has spent increasing amounts of time away from Britain, splitting his life between a villa in Barbados and a vineyard property in Portugal. On the surface, it looks like the kind of retirement most people would envy. Sunshine, ocean views, distance from the tabloids that once camped outside his door. But it is also, in a real sense, a retreat, a way of living somewhere he can walk into a shop without being watched, at the cost of being farther from the country that made him famous in the first place. Now in his mid-80s, Cliff Richard is still touring, still recording, and still remarkably candid about what that means at his age. Across 2025, he took his Can't Stop Me Now tour to Australia and New Zealand for the first time in over a decade, before bringing it home for a run of UK dates, including 2 shows at London's Royal Albert Hall, timed around his 85th birthday. Fans who have followed him for decades, some of whom met each other at his concerts 30 or 40 years ago and are still going together, describe an artist who, by all accounts, still commands a stage with the same warmth and precision he had as a much younger man. But he has been unusually candid about what it costs him to keep doing it. In interviews around the tour, he acknowledged that many radio stations simply don't play his music anymore, attributing it plainly to his age rather than any bitterness toward the industry. He has talked about how physically demanding touring has become, telling one interviewer that recovery after shows takes longer than it used to, and that he can no longer be certain, morning to morning, whether his voice will hold. Asked whether the tour might be a kind of farewell, he answered with startling directness, "I might be dead next year, so I don't even think about it anymore." He has also said plainly that he doesn't want to be an 85-year-old guy trying to be 18, a line that reads less like self-pity than simple self-awareness from a man who has spent nearly 70 years reading his own audience. What emerges from all of this isn't a scandal in the tabloid sense, no hidden identity, no secret family waiting to be uncovered. It's something quieter and, in some ways, harder to sit with. A man who built one of the most successful careers in British pop history, 14 UK #1 singles, more than 250 million records sold, chart success stretched across 8 separate decades, while privately carrying the weight of loss after loss, a public reputation that had to be legally defended in open court, and a personal life spent largely without a spouse, children, or, in recent years, the 2 people who anchored him, most, his mother and Bill Latham. The double life, in the title of this story, was never a secret second identity, no hidden family or concealed past waiting to be exposed. It was something far more ordinary and, in its own way, more universal, the unglamorous work of holding a public smile in place while grief, loneliness, and suspicion played out just out of frame, largely unseen by the audiences who thought they knew him. It's worth remembering that almost none of this was inevitable. A boy could have grown up in post-independence India, immigrated to a country that wasn't yet home, and simply lived an unremarkable life. Instead, a guitar bought by a father who wouldn't live to see where it led became the beginning of nearly 70 years in the public eye, decades in which Cliff Richard was, depending on the year, a teenage rock and roll sensation, a matinee idol, a born-again Christian rethinking his entire career, a tabloid fixture over a relationship that never became a marriage, a suspect in a case that never should have named him, a legal pioneer whose privacy case reshaped how British media can report on police investigations, and finally, an older man reflecting honestly on how much time he might have left. Cliff Richard has said he doesn't regret staying unmarried because, in his own words, you can't regret something you never had. It's a tidy line, the kind he has clearly used more than once to close off a question he's been asked 1,000 times. But those who've interviewed him over the years have often noted that there's frequently a pause after he says it, a beat that suggests some part of the question has never fully settled for him. Even now, at 85, still stepping onto stages in front of audiences who first saw him perform when they themselves were teenagers, still uncertain from one morning to the next how long his voice will hold out, he remains exactly what he has always been underneath the fame. A man who gave the public nearly everything he had for the better part of a century, while keeping the harder, quieter parts of his life mostly to himself.